All right, hello. So my name is Danny McLaren, like you just heard. I have a MA from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, in the field of gender studies, with my master's research that I'm presenting to you today into queer and trans video games and world making, which I understand as creating new, alternative, or future trans worlds. Queer and trans video games studies scholar Bo Ruberg coined the term the queer games avant-garde to describe the emerging movement of boundary-pushing, do-it-yourself games created by independent queer and trans video game makers. While varied across genre, styles, gameplay, and themes, the games of the queer games avant-garde are largely deeply trans, deeply queer, and deeply political in their aims to disrupt and resist the heteronormative, cisnormative conventions of the established mainstream games industry. These are games that are frequently single-authored or created by a small team and tell authentic, often autobiographical stories from their trans and queer creators. Trans game designers have been and continue to be integral to this movement of remaking and imagining what video games can be through interweaving trans and queer narrative themes with subversive approaches to game design that produce new, radically different forms of play that are at their core trans. I borrow from the critical approaches to technology and the social lab at University of California, Irvine in my approach to trans games and queer games as terms with multiple simultaneous meanings. I use these terms, and I'll be using them today, not only to describe games made by LGBTQ+ people or that feature those topics, but also games which utilize queer and trans as verbs, i.e. queering and transing what video games typically are and have been. Resisting, rejecting, and transgressing the homo and cisnormativity and other oppressive norms of the mainstream games industry. I have on the slide here some examples of independent queer games that I personally love and feel are very indicative of the genre. First, we have Do I Pass by Taylor McHugh, which is a game where you are a ghost and you possess the body of people on the bus. And you look into their minds to see what they're thinking about you as a trans person, to see, what they think about you and if you pass is sort of the question. Gender Wrecked by Ryan Rose Assay, which is a visual novel about queer and trans monsters and how monstrosity is like a form of gender variance. And then finally, Dysphoria by Anna Entropy, which is a game sort of like autobiographically through loose metaphors describing the experience of gender dysphoria. So these games and other are what I find most interesting and exciting about the trans-authored games of the queer games avant-garde movement. Their potential for remaking the world of video games and their radical imaginings of the ways the world outside of video games can be remade too. So in this presentation, I'll be speaking specifically about this remaking, how trans independent video games imagine liberatory trans futures and take up the task of trans world making in the stories they tell, and through the unique and generative experiences of play that they produce. I'll be speaking about one game in particular as a very strong example of this, Heaven Will Be Mine from Worst Girls Games Studio, a trans and queer game making duo written and directed by AVB with art by Max Schwartz. So Heaven Will Be Mine is a 2018 science fiction visual novel about three queer mech pilots named Pluto, Saturn, and Lunaterra from opposing factions in the war over the future of humanity in space. Two of the characters that we can see here, Pluto and Lunaterra, are explicitly stated in the text to be trans women, while the game deliberately does not specify if the third pilot, Saturn, is trans. However, her story centers on a longing for a different, non-human, non-sexed body that sits at the center of her story in very distinctly trans ways. The game is set during the final days of a failed program from Earth that attempted the colonization of space. Its story follows the three pilots as they fight against one another, fall in love with each other, and betray their factions to work together for the potential of a better, more liberatory future, in space or on Earth together. As AVB describes the game's central conflict, each side in this conflict has a grim, tragic, or insidious fate in mind for the human race, so don't feel bad about betraying them. You should make your decisions based on your heart, or who seems cute, or who you'd most prefer to be elegantly stabbed by in space. Like most visual novels, Heaven Will Be Mine's central game mechanic involves making choices and watching, or reading in this case, how these choices influence the story as it moves forward. Typically, visual novels ask you to play as one central protagonist and watch the story unfold from their perspective alone. Heaven Will Be Mine is different in that the player is allowed to experience the story from the perspective of any of its three main characters. The game presents its choices explicitly about which faction should advance in the war for the future of space. This allows the player to directly choose the outcome towards the future that they want to see realized, and then moves to show the interactions between characters and specific dialogue and actions that have led to that future coming into being. This is a reversal of the typical decision-making mechanics of video games, which give the player the option to choose individual actions or dialogue, but rarely the explicit knowledge of how these choices will affect the broader outcome of the game or the future of its world. These choices are what encourage replays of the game from each character's perspective. By playing through each route, the player builds an understanding of the character's complex relationships with one another, their roles in the conflict, and what each future may look like, which all inform the exploration of different choices in subsequent plays. So here we have sort of like the map of telling you who's winning the war, and then we have what a decision screen looks like. All the choices in Heaven Will Be Mine work to propel the story towards one of three endings, each representing the ideal future for one of its three factions. However, none of the futures that these factions seek to bring about are as liberatory as the characters have been promised. In each ending, the winning faction attempts to bring about their own quote-unquote bad future for humanity, which each foregrounds marginalization, colonization, and military violence in different ways. Whether that is through the continued conquering of space or seeking to destroy those considered less than human because of their radical divergences from cisgenderism, I guess. In the final act of each ending, the girls push back, fighting against the winning faction's plans for the future to reclaim it alongside their dreams for life in space and their liberation from the militarized conflict they once took part in. Ultimately, they are fighting to make each bad future into something that is livable for their trans and queer of color selves and their loved ones. For example, in the ending for Saturn's faction, the protagonists decide to give up their human bodies and fuse with their spaceships to remain in space forever, in resistance to the forces that try to drag them back to Earth. The faction's leader seeks to reduce the three main characters to an alien threat for the Earth to meet with violence. But the girls resist this, and in their final moments before transformation, they share their hopes for life beyond humanity with one another. They reject the Earth's view that humans and aliens are incompatible and have no way to communicate beyond violence, and hold onto the hope that while they will lose how to communicate to each other as humans do now, they will discover new ways to understand each other in ways that they never could before, ways that are loving, nonviolent, and at their core revolutionary. In this ending, the pilots refuse to continue being human like this in the conditions of Earth's militarized violence, colonialism, anti-queerness, anti-transness, and racism, while also refusing to concede that the divide between humans and non-humans is too great to ever bridge. In this ending, as in the others, the characters may not be able to change the future entirely, but their resistance makes space for them to live and live joyfully in new ways that reject the anti-queer, anti-trans, and colonial present. This is another way that Heaven Will Be Mine differs from other narrative games with multiple roots, as those games often designate some endings as good and others as bad. In Heaven Will Be Mine, each ending shows its three main characters, quote, trying to figure out ways to be happy, even if they have a bad future, in resistantly queer, trans, and anti-colonial ways. This is true even in the hidden ending, which occurs when the player is able to balance the factions to be an equal standing at the end of the game's 9-day cycle. This gives the player the option of choosing which of three regular endings they want to come into being. In the extra scene that accompanies this ending, the girls remark that none of the future are what they hoped for, dreamed for, or fought for. Saturn complains, "It's not everything I wanted. I was fighting for everything I wanted, and this is as close to it as I got. That's not enough." Pluto responds with a metatextual line that encapsulates the queer and trans of color resistance, hopefulness, and possibility that the characters work towards in each unique ending. She says, "This isn't the ending. We don't need one ending. No matter how the future turns out, no matter who wins, we can take whatever ending we get and make the ending we really want. As articulated on the Worst Girls Games website, the game's characters struggle with the ending of their science fiction dreams as they try to continue living for the future when every future seems doomed. This is the tension at the heart of Heaven Will Be Mine, between dreaming of the liberatory trans future and fighting to make the bad futures available to us more livable, even possibly joyful for all trans and queer people, but especially trans and queer people of color. Heaven Will Be Mine is also world-making in its exploration of transition and bodily transformation in space, in ways that are both fantastical and explicitly name transness and processes of gender transition. The game explores the possibilities for trans body in space, away from the restricting forces of human physicality and transphobia on Earth. Perhaps the most obvious way that AVV, the writer, brings this into the story is through its multiple trans characters and their explicit dialogue that explores how life in space has shaped their transitions. To trans femme characters, Pluto and Lunaterra, space has allowed their bodies to shift, change, and transform in ways that were never possible on Earth. In a conversation between them, Lunaterra praises Pluto for not allowing the Earth's gravity to choose the shape of her body, and for showing her how to make that choice too. Gravity here is a central metaphor of the game for both the physical and sociocultural limitations that act upon the characters' bodies on Earth. In the physical sense, gravity ties their bodies to a certain physical shape, such as an assigned sex at birth, and keeps them grounded away from the possibility of change and exploration in space. At the same time, their bodies and lives are also socially constrained within the gravity of the gender binary and cisnormativity, which shape the meaning of their sex in rigid ways. But these forces continue to exist in space, as the game recognizes through its core messages of resisting futures built on the violence of current systems of oppression. In the logs available on Saturn's Spaceship Hub, the player gains access to the transcript of a medical appointment with her friend, Mercury. Mercury is a trans man, and his body is examined as part of the research into the effects of space on the human body. When his medical examiner questions if the increased levels of testosterone in his system and his sudden masculine presentation are a side effect of life in space, he responds, "No, that's backwards. Everyone else gets to do whatever they want without limitations in space. Why is it weird when I do it?" This scene echoes the experience of many trans people who face systemic violence at the hands of medical practitioners, both in attempting to access gender-affirming care and receiving the forms of necessary medical care. By replicating this type of transphobic violence in the supposedly utopian setting of space, especially for his trans character, who, unlike the others, has yet to defect from his military faction, Heaven Will Be Mine demonstrates how new worlds cannot be liberatory for trans people if they stem from the same oppressive systems that make up our current worlds. The times in which the trans characters find the greatest liberation and self-actualization is when they break away from the physical and sociocultural limits of Earth and forge new ways of being, in ways that may not be recognizable as normatively human anymore. In two possible endings, like I've spoken about, the main characters radically shift their bodies and ways of being to, in one way, embody their ideal selves by living in their spaceships forever, or transcending their bodies entirely, creating new ones made out of stars. In these ways, the characters of Heaven Will Be Mine open up new possibilities for being trans in the future by fighting the pull of gravity, working against the power structures that do harm to queer and trans people of color, and both figuratively and literally creating new worlds out of their own bodies. Heaven Will Be Mine shows its characters fighting for a better future and embracing the possibilities of life and embodiment away from the violence and oppression of Earth. Through the game's 3 unique endings, which each show a different bad future, I argue that the game explores how its queer and trans femme of color characters fight and resist to shift the future towards something livable, while keeping hope for a truly liberatory future to come. Each ending to the game presents a different possibility for an alternate future, which foregrounds queer and trans political resistance and struggle. By playing all 3 endings, the character is invited to perform the resistant actions of each protagonist and to watch her embodied critiques of her faction's vision for the oppressive future, as well as the character's joint struggles for a better one. Games like Heaven Will Be Mine point towards the world-making potential of trans and queer authored video games and how they communicate meaning by actively inviting players into the worlds they've created and encouraging them to carry those feelings forward into the world outside of games. These games are examples of how queer and trans indie games can connect the politics of games and the politics of the real world through the liberatory values they share and the multiple possibilities for resistance they explore. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jay. I use they, them, or zero pronouns, and I am going to be presenting the plans for my dissertation as well as kind of some background on the topic. And so right now the full working title is Experiences from Outside the Binary, How Trans, with an asterisk, Individuals Use Fan Work as a Space for Gender Exploration. So real quick, even though I am presenting here, I want to acknowledge that I live and work from the city of Calgary, which is on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, which include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I'm just very happy that I get to live and work there and do some amazing research. So the plan for today is to introduce my research questions. I've got a brief note about language and terminology and the struggle with doing research around that, some background context, and then I'll introduce the working document for my project. So my primary research question for this study really asks, how do trans, non-binary, and other gender diverse individuals use their engagement with online queer fan works as an avenue or a space for gender exploration and development? And within this project, I'm really seeking to explore how my participants employ these online queer fan works when it comes to really understanding and conceptualizing both this larger construct of gender as an entity, as well as their own personal gender and experiences. So, for example, one of the things that I want to look at is in what ways do they utilize these fan works specifically to reflect on and process their own unique circumstances when it comes to gender. Other components that I'm looking at include, do people use different forms of engagement with fan works in different ways, like when they're producing or consuming these works? And what role do the community aspect of fandom and fan work spaces really play into this process? So really quickly, before progressing too much further, I just want to talk a little bit about language. So in modern Western society and in most Western-based scholarship, the word queer has really grown to encompass a range of meanings. For many, it has become the default to use queer and queerness as an umbrella term for sexuality and gender that is other than cis or straight. However, historically, it has also been used to refer to things that are like strange, odd, or really just don't fit within a specific category. And so within my project, I'm primarily use the term queer to identify queer subjects, i.e. those that are consistently marginalized from normative and socially accepted identity categories. I'm also distinctly engaging in this term through a critical and empowering view. So the term queer at its heart marks all of those who that really hegemonic normative categorizations either cannot or will not make space for. And as we all know, dominant society seeks to exert its control by trying to force those conventional categorizations onto all of us. And for those of us who do not fit within those categorizations, we are made explicitly aware of this when we become pushed into those other categories. So for this project to really engage in queer perspectives in a distinctly positive way, to place those queer perspectives front and center becomes an act of reclamation and empowerment. But with that being said, I still do want to really encourage that anyone who's either engaging with my work or other work in this area to be critical of how we use terms like queer. Hegemonic discourse is still very much so centered around white, male, cisgender, and monosexual perspectives. And so we have to be wary of complacency around the language we use, even in alternative, progressive, and/or queer spaces, such as this conference. Furthermore, when we step outside of the dominant social structure of the rigid gender binary, we're also stepping outside of the bounds of what contemporary, in this case English, language was created to articulate. And thus, when it comes to trans experiences, we might also struggle to really confront the limitations of contemporary language, namely in its lack of enough words that really encompass the expansive variety of trans markers and experiences. Can someone hand me my bottle? Hydrate or die straight, apparently. So anyways, right. Yes. As such, there are a lot of times within my work that I am really ill at ease with the language that I settle upon. And I often find myself going back and forth over the words, terminology, and phrases that I use, and I am never 100% happy. But I also find that these moments of discomfort are a really crucial part of both my work and just work in this area in general. So for example, you might notice that I use the term trans with an asterisk in it. And I do this very intentionally to denote both transgender identities, as well as all the individuals whose gender identity and experiences fall outside of that like very rigid cisgender binary, but who might not identify with the specific label of transgender. So really just trying to find a more inclusive way to use it as an umbrella term. So now that I've talked for a long time about language, some background about this topic. So in the present day has really heralded a time of ever-growing understanding and acceptance of queer identities and experiences, though it doesn't always feel like that. Yet we still continue to see mainstream Western media primarily promote cisnormativity through its often problematic representations or limited representations of queer and especially trans narratives. So in response, fandom, especially queer, trans, and non-binary fans, turn to making and sharing queer fan works. And these fan works are creative works produced by a fan based on a book, movie, television show, band, whatever it is, generally intended for other fans. And these can include fan fiction, fan art, cosplay, skits, making videos, really any kind of creative work can be a fan work. So within these processes of deconstructing these very like traditional cis-normative narratives we see in media, we can see queer fan creators are also really questioning the assumptions and normative understandings of gender intrinsic to the cisgender and heteronormative culture that they inhabit, and by extension that media inhabits. Furthermore, by focusing on those who are really not allowed to inhabit the contours of cisnormative spaces, the creators of these queer fan works are really establishing alternative narratives and stories where cis and heteronormative, within this cis and heteronormative world, either in the media and also in real life. And this opens the possibility for all manners of queerness, not only being visible, but inherently possible. Similarly, to producing, even just consuming these queer fan works and engaging in these spaces encourages individuals to really rethink these conditioned cis and heteronormative practices, even if they're not producing the works themselves. And this point in particular is really important when it comes to understanding how these fan works might engage and encourage individuals to analyze their own internalized hegemonic understandings of gender, even if we're not consciously turning to fan works for that purpose. Oh my God, I'm talking slow. So the advent of the internet in particular has really allowed for the creation of online queer fan work driven spaces where now individuals from all around the world, each with their own unique cultural conceptions of gender, connect over this production and consumption of alternative queer narratives. These online spaces, individuals now have access to a wealth of information and anecdotal accounts pertaining to the exploration and understanding of gender that are bound by neither specific mainstream societal expectations nor geographical limitations of offline spaces, including fandom spaces. And thus, these spaces... Never going to happen. So these spaces are often now become sites of exploration and play when it comes to personal, especially queer identities. So we can really see that in these digital arenas, fandom members have really found a space for exploring their understandings of gender and what it means in the context of their very specific life experiences. And we can see that fans intentionally and sometimes subconsciously end up utilizing these transformative power of these fan works to navigate their own personal growth and transformation. But even with this knowledge, our understanding of exactly how trans individuals use these online queer fan workspaces, especially when it comes to exploring and developing these inherently non-hegemonic conceptualizations of gender, often leaves us with more questions than answers. And this is even more troubling when we consider the fact that historically, which feels weird to say about the internet, but historically, trans individuals have turned to the internet for community and support from other trans people, especially when they don't get that offline. So a little bit of theory and methodology. For this project, I'm primarily using, in case anyone's curious, trans and intersectional approaches for queer theory, especially looking at trans and queer phenomenology, which for those of you who don't know what any of that is, it's okay. Basically, this means that I am trying to expand traditional theory, especially queer theory, for four main reasons. One, to take in the embodied and very lived experiences of my participants around gender, which weirdly enough is not super common. Two, challenging the cisnormative aspects seen within contemporary theory and academic spaces to account for the role of race and other social identities in our understandings and experiences of gender, and also to queer contemporary research methods, because a lot of these are built upon many harmful hegemonic norms, as most of academia is, and so they're not really built to explore trans experiences. So for this study, hit it too fast. Participation is basically going to be open to anyone who self-identifies as trans, non-binary, or other gender diverse, and they have to engage in some form of fan work, but they do not have to be out about their transness in day-to-day life. And what's really cool is because this project focuses on people's engagement with online queer fan works, participation is not restricted to any one country or nation. And so I'm really excited to see what kind of perspectives get to be brought to the table and shared with all of us. And then also, what's really cool is I get to recruit on social media and places like Discord servers, which gives me an excuse to go on more Discord servers. So when it comes to information collection, this is actually what I'm really excited about. So for this project, I do plan on using interviews. So they're specifically very collaborative, in-depth multimedia interviews. So what does that mean? My focus in these interviews primarily is really to facilitate my participants sharing their stories with me, which means I'm mainly just asking general open-ended questions that really invite these storied responses, and paying special attention to what they tell me. And within this study, another key component is that multimedia aspect. So I'm asking my participants to bring and share various pieces of media going into and throughout the interview. So for example, prior to the interview, I'll be asking my participants to share with me items or a collection of items that depict how they view gender. And this could be either their own gender or just gender as a thing. This could include images, mood boards, collages, audio recordings, anything. And I do this for several reasons. So first, it starts establishing the space that we exist in as a distinctly non-cisgender space. And one that makes room for any manner of alternative conceptualizations of gender. Two, this gives me the ability to really see how each person currently views gender in ways that may not be able to be conveyed verbally, because how many of us really struggle to convey our exact gender in words. Third, I see this as a really empowering first step in the interview process, one which I'm acknowledging that my participants are the experts regarding the unique nuances to their engagement with gender, and they know the best way to share them to me. I also ask my participants to share before the interview bits of media or fan work that come to mind or they think would be important within the context of my study, because again, it's a very collaborative process. I want to see what they want to talk about as well. And during the interview, I also ask that anything we talk about, they send to me. So whether that's media, whether that's GIFs, anything. And not only are my participants in these places sharing media with me in a way that's unique to them, but in sharing and talking about these bits of media, I'm also really encouraging a back and forth dialogue between my participants as part of that collaborative knowledge process. And this engagement with visual media and text in my study really introduces the potential to collect knowledge and stories that would not be possible through traditional interview methods alone, and or that might be hard to convey through words alone. And it's also important for establishing this project, again, as a collaborative knowledge producing process with my participants, especially in the digital age. We really need to acknowledge that researchers and academics are not the only producers of knowledge. We're just the ones who are sometimes supported by formal institutions of knowledge and power. And really, if you need an example of that, you only have to take one look into a lot of fandom spaces, and you will see individuals engaging with discussions and debates not unlike what we see in academic spaces, such as this conference. And so we really need to take their knowledge seriously as well. Yeah. And like I said, this is still a work in progress. So I'm absolutely open to ideas, suggestions, good vibes, well wishes. But yeah, that is it.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sage Dunn-Krahn, and my pronouns are he, him. And I'm an undergraduate here at UVic in the Medieval Studies program. And today I'm going to be talking even more about, oh, Jay is tall. Thank you. I'm going to be talking more about fan fiction. But I'm going to be exploring a different side of fanfic than Jay was discussing. I'm going to be talking about transfic and mental health and the darker aspects of trans fanfic in general. I'm trans and I'm a fan, so this topic is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm very excited to be here to just closer. Okay, to talk about one of my favorite topics. So before we get started here, I just wanted to give a quick content warning, as I am going to be discussing darker aspects of fanfic. This will include discussions of mental health issues, suicide, violence, dysphoria, trauma, etc. Although I won't be getting into any of these things in detail, but be warned and take care of yourself. All right. So let's start out with the definition of some terms. Thanks, Jay, already for a great definition of Fanworks. I'm going to be focusing on a particular type of fan fiction, which is fiction written by fans based on an existing work. Trans fans, as the name suggests, are fans who are trans. Transfic is fanfic by, for, or about trans people. Do note that not all transfic is necessarily written by trans people. And finally, darkfic is fanfiction that deals with disturbing or heavy material such as physical and emotional violence, mental health issues, etc. So the primary data source for my project was the Archive of Our Own, also known as the AO3, which is a web archive of Fanworks. It's one of many Fanwork archives, but it is unique in that it was originally created by fans for fans, so it's structured towards the needs of fans. It was founded in 2008 by the Organization for Transformative Works. T? Okay. Oh.
Yeah, it's
I don't see it.
a glitch.
That's okay. I haven't gotten to the graphs yet, so it's not very important.
All right, I think we're good.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yay. Thanks, Big Guy. So the Archive of Our Own was founded in 2008 by the Organization for Transformative Works, also known as the OTW. And while the archive is just that, an archive, not a social media, it is individuals who are uploading their own work rather than any organization or curator. And finally, something important to note for my research in particular is that the AO3 has a really robust tagging system. Works are uploaded with user-added tags about the content of the fan fiction, the characters, the themes, tropes, etc. And these tags are super valuable for tracking trends and patterns of fan work creation. So I'd just like to talk a little bit first about why I think the archive matters in terms of trans research and why we should study fan fiction. Trans fan fiction makes up, at this point, over 1% of the Archive of Our Own, which doesn't seem like a lot until you realize there are over 10 million fanfics on the website, which means that there are over 100,000 fanfics dealing with trans characters. Which makes the Archive of Our Own, as far as I know, the largest collection of online fiction by, for, and about trans people. In 2002, the GLAAD Where Are We on TV report counts 32 trans characters across mainstream TV. And in the same year, there were 38,000 fics posted on the AO3 with a trans character in them. Now, of course, these are two very different in terms of audience and reach. But as you can see, that for tracking trends, there's just a huge difference in scale here between mainstream depiction versus the archive. This is a graph about the rise of trans fan fiction within the archive over the past 10 years. So I think this is a resource that has been really criminally overlooked and undervalued. I suspect this is mainly because it's derivative work rather than original work, but just because it's derivative doesn't mean that it actually says anything less about the emotions and issues of the people who are writing it. It's a really valuable resource for understanding trends and patterns in the trans imagination and the motives and interests of trans writers. Another reason to study transfic is that it challenges our narratives about representation and especially how we think about good and bad representation. There's been a lot of understandable anxiety about representation of trans people in the media because we've seen the ways that negative representation can produce transphobia. But I think the reaction to that has been a push for good representation that can sometimes tip over into simplistic representation that is palatable to cis people, but that doesn't really dig into the multiplicity of trans experiences and the ambivalence of those experiences. And this is where transfic can really pick up the slack, because you've got a lot of different diverse people who are writing from direct experience. And the sheer number of fic means that the representation is going to be wider. So you might expect that when trans people write about themselves, it would be what we called good representation, but that's not always the case. Transfic as a whole is much more likely to deal with dark, disturbing, or heavy material than other types of fanfic. I first became interested in this topic when I was doing some research into the trans tags and found that the mental health issues tag is significantly more likely to appear in transfic than they are in the archive as a whole. And as you can see here, transfics are tagged with mental health issues 8% of the time, whereas the archive as a whole is tagged with mental health issues only 3% of the time. So I decided to go deeper into dark fic tags, seeing how they interacted with trans character tags. We'll start out here with mental health issues. As you can see on the left, I've got the trans character tag, and on the right, I've got the archive as a whole. For every single one of these categories, trans characters have a higher percentage of fics tagged with these specific tags than in the archive total. The percentage is higher in every case, but I've highlighted the ones which are significantly higher, which are mental health issues, as I just discussed, suicide, anxiety, and self-harm. Moving on to warning tags. Warnings are a category of tags within the archive which are mandatory. Again, warnings are more common for transfic, especially rape, underage, and violence, but major character death is actually lower than in the archive, which is pretty interesting. Here I analyzed trans-specific experiences, i.e. transphobia and gender dysphoria. As expected, these are much higher than in the archive as a whole, with transphobia being tagged in 8.5% of transfic and gender dysphoria being tagged in 5.5%. And these tags get really interesting when you break it down into gender categories within the trans character tag, such as trans male character and non-binary character, which I will get into later. And finally, these are some tags which are part of dark fic. I think the most important one here is probably the abuse tag, which is significantly higher in the trans character tag than in the archive, with 10% in the trans character and 4% in the archive. Another interesting one is the hurt comfort tag, which has 13 compared to 9%. And again, in every single one of these dark fic tags is higher in the trans character tag than in the archive, except for WUMP, which is very interesting, but I can't get into now. As I was discussing before, it gets really interesting when you break it down into gender categories. And here I've broken it down into 3 categories: trans male character, trans female character, and non-binary character. And this is really important because it shows that trans experiences are not a monolith, and that within gender category, there's a lot of variation on how themes are used. An important thing to recognize when we're breaking this down into gender categories is that within the trans character tag, there's not an equal distribution of gender. As you can see, trans male character makes up almost half of the tag, with non-binary character making up 40%, and then trans female character only making up 14% of the tag. This is unfortunately pretty consistent with the archive as a whole, which does skew towards male characters. But it is pretty interesting that non-binary character is so much more than trans female character. This might be indicative of the kind of people who are writing this fic. There are a few places where the difference is pronounced, mostly around the non-binary character tag. So non-binary, I should know how to pronounce that word. Non-binary character fics are more likely to be tagged with mental health issues in general, and especially suicide, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and violence. However, non-binary character fics are much less likely to be tagged with transphobia and gender dysphoria, and even less likely to be tagged with rape or non-con. Fics tagged with the trans female character tag are less likely than non-binary or trans male fics to deal with mental health issues. And these trans female character fics are significantly less likely to be tagged with suicide. However, trans female character fics are also more likely to be tagged with transphobia and gender dysphoria. Oh, I don't have time to talk about this. Yeah, this is really interesting as we come to compare it. No, this is not the right one. I'm going to stay there. When we come to compare this with other sources of data about trans people in reality, for example, the 2015 US Transgender Survey report found that transgender women and cross-dressers were more likely to have experienced sexual assault than transgender men and non-binary people. There we go. However, in the archive, trans male characters are much more likely to be tagged with the sexual assault tag. And I think that really calls into question the relationship between reality and fiction and the way that people are using fiction. I definitely don't think it's a one-to-one relationship between the ways that people write about trans people and the actual experiences of people in real life. Okay. So to wrap up, I just wanted to provide a couple reflections on this data and maybe offer a couple of hypotheses as to what's going on here and why this is happening. On the one hand, the data is clear that trans people tend to deal with more mental health issues in their life than cis people, and it makes sense to me that TRANSFIC would be a way for trans authors to work through those issues. In his article, The Dysphoric Body Politic or Seizing the Means of Imagination, Charlie Ledbetter says, "Dark fic gets me. The experience of naming my trauma and having it acknowledged in fiction gives me a sense of consistency and therefore relief." He then goes on to describe the series of feelings that dark fic allows him to go through: relief, naming dysphoric feelings, rage, rebelling against conditions that produce dysphoric feelings, and euphoria, imagining structures that inspire consonant feelings. And this ties into my own conception of fanfic as an emotional personal project where powerful and often painful feelings are explored in a safe way. It creates a kind of fictional space in which to test and experiment with feelings, or sometimes just to experience feelings which you wouldn't have otherwise encountered in real life. On the other hand, I think that this explanation is good, but it doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. I think that there's a lot of different things going on here, and I don't think that everyone has the same motive for writing what they write. One thing that you might have noticed is that there are a lot of dark fic tags that I analyzed that aren't necessarily related to being trans, which are still higher in the trans character tag than in the archive as a whole. There isn't necessarily a one-to-one ratio of trauma that people experience and the darker themes that they explore in their writing. I think that there's something probably bigger going on here than just people directly working out their own issues through fic. Just ignore those memes. Finally, I just wanted to come back to this idea of good and bad representation. A lot of dark fic is what we would consider to be bad representation because it portrays trans characters as fallible and very imperfect. It portrays them in pain. It portrays them as sometimes evil, as having a lot of issues and problems. Generally, we like to keep things simple. Trans people like to see good representation on screen, and that means trans people succeeding and thriving. But for me, I like reading fic about trans people more than I like mainstream representations of trans people because it feels real. It's much more true to my own experience and has a familiarity about it. Like the writer has an intimate understanding of what it's like to be trans. And as we enter into what looks like an era of decreased queer representation in mainstream media, I think it's time to stop relying on media conglomerates to have our best interests at heart and start investing in community-centered art production like fan fiction. And if you're interested in learning more, I have many links here that you can check out. Maybe you will come and talk to me after. Or you could take a picture of that. I've got also this QR code that I actually forgot where that goes. So have fun. I'll plug my own Tumblr as well. It's at the bottom. I post more about data analysis about fanfic, especially transfic. Anyways, that's my presentation. Thank you for listening.
In my talk, I will consider the role of negative emotions in a trans girl's coming of age story. And my approach draws on cultural theorizing on emotions and that offer views to anger and rage as productive and transformative. And my reading is primarily inspired by Hilma Latino's writings on trans rage. And I focus on trans rage and anger because they are rarely present in stories about trans women.
Yeah, sorry about this. It's okay, we'll get you on. You're ready to go.
Okay, yes, thank you. Trans anger and rage are not often articulated and shared beyond trans communities. And so I will offer a reading of Kai Cheng Thom's novel, Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, a dangerous trans girl's confabulous memoir. And I will first tell you a little bit about the novel. Kai Cheng Thom is a Chinese-Canadian writer, artist and activist, and this is her first novel. It's a coming of age story of an Asian trans girl who runs away from home and joins a community of trans women. And the story focuses a lot on her life in the community. And the community consists of women, trans women who work on the streets, and many of them are women of color. And this is clearly a coming of age story, but it's so much more. It's a hybrid story that challenges and disrupts genres, conventions, and narrative frames of stories about trans individuals. The narration includes prose, poems, dialogues in a manner of drama scene, and then also it conflicts fantastical elements and fairy tale to the narrative. The novel addresses the problem of transgender representation and comments on the trans memoir genre as well. In the beginning of the story, the narrator protagonist states that she does not believe in safe spaces because they don't exist. Instead, she believes in dangerous stories that make people listen, and I quote, "The kind of story that doesn't wait for you to invite or enter, but bursts through the doors of your rat-infested house like a glittering wind, hungry to snatch up the carpet and scatter your papers and smash every single plate in the kitchen," unquote. The protagonist makes clear that this story will not be an often repeated story of a white trans woman who is beautiful and rich, or tragic and suffering orphan who gets to be like everyone else. And she's very frustrated by the lack of dangerous and intense stories of trans girls. The protagonist experienced a lot of really strong emotions, such as anger, rage, and fear, which often burst out as violent physical force. And in many ways, anger works as a resource for her. As Hilma Latino suggests, anger and rage can protect the subject and deflect attention away from profound hurt. As such, it offers a critical resource and key to survival for minoritized subjects. It encourages to break those relationships that do not sustain a person and shields from that which seeks to harm. In the novel, and especially in the beginning of the story, anger helps the protagonist to make the decision to run away from home. It is a force that puts things into motion. Her anger also protects her. She uses her feelings of anger to protect herself when she's, for example, harassed by a strange man on a rest stop. Instead of being submissive, she kicks and hits the man with animal fury. The bees work as an engaging and versatile metaphor that can be interpreted in many ways, but I see the bees as a central metaphor for the protagonist's relation to unresolved and difficult feelings, emotions, and affects. The bees appear at moments when the protagonist experiences an intensified moment of affect, which may lead to rage and violent behavior. The metaphor of bees is introduced in a chapter entitled The Lesson of the Bees. And in this chapter, the protagonist recalls being 6 years old when a swarm of killer bees fly into her room and cover her entire body. The only thing she can do is to lay as still as possible until the bees fly away. But some of the bees stay with her, and I quote, "Addicted to my sweet blood, they crawled up inside my body and built their nests there. They are still inside me. They will always be," unquote. The bees are described as a boiling cloud of rage and desire, a complex knot of feelings and embodied experience that is connected both to the past and the future. The novel does not observe anger and rage only on an individual level, but also as collectivized. Feminist philosopher Maria Lugones elaborates how anger that challenges respectability rejects practices and sense-making wherein one is being dehumanized. This kind of transformative anger provides resource for working through internalized oppressions. According to Hilma Latino, transformative anger can also be collectivized. It can become a protest when it resonates with several people. In Tom's novel, the transformative anger that rejects transphobia and dehumanization starts to collectivize in the community after a girl named Soraya is found dead in a dumpster and she has been beaten to death. The abiding feelings of rage and anger resonate in the community because the trans women recognize and share a similar social position with Soraya, in which they are targets of harassment, discrimination, and violence. The community of trans girls has witnessed violent deaths of other trans girls during the years, and then now they decide to do something about it. They start talking about how they could respond to what has happened. One of the girls suggests they should fight back, but Kimaya, who is a leading figure in the community, says that violence is not the answer. But there's so much anger resonating within the community that they feel that they need to do something they have not done before. Malatino speaks of collectivized anger as enabling transformative world making, a possibility for making other worlds and other ways of being. In Fierce Femmes, the community feels how they are changing, and this signals how their collectivized anger generates a transformation. The community then decides to form a vigilante girl gang, Lipstick Lacerators, who fight against cis men who come to the streets where the trans girls work. Lipstick Lacerators beat up men and steal their money. Soon the girl gang is in the headlines, and the city decides to retaliate against the girl gang. And first, there's a group of men with baseball bats who come to the streets. And the girl gang fight against them with renewed rage, and I quote, "Valeria raises her arms and howls in victory, and the rest of us do the same, intoxicated by our own power and violence. None of us have ever felt anything like this, regardless of how long we spent living off the street of miracles. Nothing has prepared us to feel this connected to one another, to feel this strong," unquote. Here, the rage that generates the transformation is mutating to something else. The sense of connection and community is strong, and it's still based on the shared trans rage. But the violence also generates a new intoxicating sense of power. Instead of protecting and defending each other from violence, the Lipstick Lacerators become hunters who search for cis men to beat them up. The violence seems not to offer repair for the community, and some members of the girl gang start to wonder if the violence hurts the femmes more than it helps. Finally, policemen with megaphones and guns enter the streets to catch the girl gang. In a violent incident, the protagonist hits a policeman in order to prevent him to shoot one of her friends, and the policeman dies. This is a turning point in the narrative, and although the protagonist uses violence to save her friend, she sees a problem with violence because it will probably have negative consequences for her community. A violent way of dealing with anger has become an automatic response that does not foster personal or communal flourishing. Audre Lorde, a poet and radical feminist activist, stresses the importance of learning from different forms of anger by voicing them and listening to them. According to Lorde, if anger remains unspoken, it is useless to anyone. For Lorde, the transformative significance of anger lies in voicing, hearing, and writing about anger. This is the way to move forward. In Tom's novel, although the anger is collectivized and inspires the community to fight back, it also orients the community to unwanted directions and contradictions. After killing the police, the protagonist sees nightmares, and the complex feelings and emotions she goes through amplify her embodied experience of the buzzing bees. At the same time, however, the protagonist becomes more and more aware of how the bees, or the intensifying knot of unresolved feelings, is closely connected to her internalized hatred. She wants to find a way out of violence, but this is something in which she needs help from others. The first step in seeking help is to visit a community member, Alzina the witch. She exposes her secrets to Alzina or reveals her vulnerability to her. And I quote, "Alzina knows that I'm filled with secrets and bloodlust killer bees, and that everything I touch falls apart. But even though she can see all these things, Alzina doesn't look disgusted or pitying. She just looks," unquote. The next step in finding her way out of violence is sharing her story. Or this could be also called beforming trans rage, to borrow trans studies scholar Susan Stryker's term in an article in which she ponders on trans rage that is generated by the unstable relationship between language and materiality. Himaya, the leading figure of the community, organizes a storytelling and performance evening for the community. The protagonist listens to people's stories, and finally she's handed the mic and she starts to tell her story to the audience. Finally, she bakes a forgiveness cake, something sweet to catch the bees. All these steps, revealing her vulnerability, voicing her story to the community, and the act of baking the forgiveness cake work as tools for processing her anger and rage and developing trans rage into resilience. Putting her story into words so that it can be shared is central in the process of dealing with rage, fear, and violence. The violence has been a way to act when words fail her. The protagonist is able to change not because of anger, but because of her community, who helps her in processing her feelings in ways that sustain the transformative effects of rage. I will probably skip this, but I just say that in the end of the novel, the power of sharing and storytelling is emphasized. And the protagonist tells how she's writing the story to the community and continuum of dangerous girls that is formed across time. And also I have a lot of summary here, but maybe I will just state that the novel deals with anger and rage in multiple levels and shows both how they can be transformative and constricting. And it also demonstrates how anger and rage can be reclaimed and processed within the trans community. Thank you.